Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
We're back with our continuing coverage of the And Nothing Less podcast, looking at the centenary of women's suffrage here in the United States and all sorts of other global implications. We're up to episode 5, which is entitled Sister Suffragette, which tips its cap that we'll be talking. The episode is talking mostly about the connections between the transatlantic suffrage movements in the United States and in the United Kingdom. But it starts the episode by saying it's about the fight for the vote around the world, and then pretty much just talks about England, which was not our favorite part of this series, but that's probably because we lived in the UK for 5 years, and specifically Dr. Kristen taught British suffrage, so a lot of this was not new information for both of us. And we recognize that going in. So if you didn't know anything about British suffrage, I'm sure you thought this was a fantastic episode. And I think it was. They made a really good argument for this kind of international spreading of information and how these movements influenced each other, specifically the British and American ones, which there was a really strong connection because of our friend Alice Paul and her time in the UK, incarcerated as a suffragist. We're going to use suffragist, even though they used suffragette. And then she returns to the United States and, like, boom, goes into militant suffragism. So, like, it's worth making that point, and I'm glad that they did, but we kind of have our own little asterisk.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, and like we said, I'll say it just from my own mouth, it's a lot of selfish critiques in a way. But also, like, not, if you're going to tell the story of British suffrage, there's a really important event that needs to be told, which is the death of Emily Davidson at the Epsom Derby, and was one of the catalysts to women getting the vote, and the public opinion of women getting the vote in the UK. The story is that, and there's a lot of debate over motive here. But the basic story is that during the Epsom Derby, which is a horse race, a suffrage activist stepped from the crowd and tried to attach fabric to the king's horse, and was trampled to death. Mm-hmm. There's lots of debate over and her name was Emily Davidson, if Emily was doing it to be a martyr and knew she was going to get trampled to death and knew what she was going to do. She has several contemporaries who claimed that was the case. Mm-hmm. Or if it was an accident, she was simply trying to put something onto the bridle of the Votes for Women banner onto the bridle of the king's horse, and that the death was a tragic accident. You know, it can go either way, but she's a really significant figure. And American women knew about Emily's death. Yeah. It was not, especially because some of the American women knew Emily personally from some of their Alice Paul was not the only American that spent time in the UK. So they were friends with Emily. They knew these kind of things. So that felt like a bit of an oversight to me in this. If we're going to focus so much on the UK, let's talk about Emily Davidson. And that would be, especially because she's enjoyed quite a resurgence of legacy, I should say. The 100-year centenary of that event, of her death, occurred not that long ago, I think in 2013 or 2014, forgive me. But the UK sponsored quite a few programs about her. A very famous British broadcaster and horsewoman named Claire Balding actually did a long expose on the process, and I think taught a lot of modern Brits about their own suffrage history.
Suffrage history, yeah.
Because all my students were like, who's this bird? And anyway, so it's just really, so that's my kind of, somebody who did this for a little while criticism. And then my other someone who did this for a little while criticism is that I really wish they would have teased out a little bit more the connection of suffrage and temperance in New Zealand, since New Zealand was the first country that gave women full suffrage. And as far as I know, they say that. I don't know if it was even full suffrage. I don't know if it was tiered racially the way it was here. I don't know, I need to look into that for sure. But I would have appreciated a little bit more time spent not in England or America.
Right. It was definitely racialized suffrage, because I know from our happy birthday blog and social media post series that we celebrated the birthday of a leading New Zealand suffragette who I am not going to remember her name, obviously, because I'm terrible at names. But yeah, it was only for, I believe, white women in New Zealand, but I would have to double check that. Yeah, so it was kind of an odd setup to start talking about votes for women around the world and to lead into this fascinating connection between temperance and the suffrage movement and labor movement and all of these kind of global happenings of social democratic movements around the world. And then to just be like, we're just going to stick to England. And really not even get that much into specific suffragettes in England. Emmeline Pankhurst was kind of just thrown in.
Yeah, she was just like given a name drop and then moved on. And
I was like, okay. And it was more about the inspiration that American women drew from British suffrage than British suffrage, which I understand they have
a remit. It just feels like a missed opportunity.
Yeah. So for me, like, I didn't teach suffrage when I was in the UK. So a lot of this stuff I knew, but had forgotten bits of it. So I think it's really important to show kind of the global politics of the First World War, which a lot of times we don't talk about, and the way that, Wilson kind of standing up for democracy globally forced the lens back to suffrage. And I thought that was a really interesting part of the podcast when they were talking about the decision for members and aspects of the American suffrage movement to join or to support the war actively. And so that was stuff I actually didn't know. And
I am glad they brought up the connection with the flu pandemic, because that is not something that people focus on enough.
Right.
But that was a major factor on both sides of the pond, as it were, in how people began to understand women's roles on the planet. The combination of World War I into the influenza.
Right.
And there was just some flat out some population issues. There was maybe not enough men to elect any other men. So we had to start getting a little bit more pragmatic about gender roles. So.
Yeah. And, war, very often conflict and disease kind of force those issues. And we're seeing a lot of those discussions taking place now during this coronavirus pandemic as well. And, we're seeing mainstream conversations about income inequality and access to water and healthcare services, but also paid leave and, unpaid labor that women, statistically dramatically incur more than men. So, global crises kind of have that impact. And I thought it was important for their international episode to talk about that.
Correct. You're correct.
And like the thing that I just wanted to end on for my take on this was I loved the discussion at the end about this metaphor of the waves.
Yeah.
And we talk about, waves of American feminism, but I loved that. And I think it wasn't Elaine Weiss, it was Ellen Du Bois, I think. But
I believe, yes. Yeah, at the end, yep.
Their voices sounded very similar. Who said, she loves to talk about the idea of waves like as what they actually are, and to think more about the feminist movements and feminism traveling around the globe on these currents of information and politics and social change and all of that. So I think that was such a great way to end it. And what I would want to draw out of that is the way that we teach and talk about history, especially in the United States. But really around the world, history is taught as a national history, where whatever that nation is, and then a world history. And that's highly influenced by politics as well. But it's really a global history. And when you teach US history and then European history, oftentimes you miss a lot of those waves going back and forth and the impact of that. So I thought it was a great point to end on, and hopefully they continue that metaphor of waves going forward and maybe explore some other parts of suffrage around the world. Who knows?
Yeah, one of my favorite points is the point of the silent Sentinels, which needs to always be talked about more, that suffrage Suffrage activists are who invented protesting in front of the White House, which I love because it is the people's house. And if things are happening in that house that we don't care for, we get to say that. That's part of this designed, that's one of the pieces of the system that was not designed to be unequal. It was actually designed to be democratic.
One of the few.
One of the few. So there's that. I think it's also a really great reminder that there's a lot of ways to attack the same problem and have a lot of very valid views. Carrie Catt was a pacifist through and through and through and through, but also a master tactician. And she understood what that tact strategically, what it would mean for her to be a pacifist and what it would bring. And I think it was important that there was both pacifist and activist movements or within suffrage as we came out of World War I, and kind of just the reminder that complicated problems require complicated solutions. Yeah.
And that no movement is a monolith, right? That's another great thing that this podcast, every episode, has done really well, and that we need to continue to do, is by complicating this narrative, these historical narratives, we're going beyond our cursory knowledge of Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and saying, oh, hey, wait, this was really complicated. There were lots of perspectives, lots of different parts of this movement, and all of these puzzle pieces come together to make this huge image of what suffrage looks like in the United States and around the world. So always great to throw a spanner in the works, as they'd say in the UK.
Yeah, and I mean, a mediocre episode of this podcast is still excellent.
Yeah.
To be, the bar that they've set is really, really high. And it's not that this one didn't deliver, it's just that we think that this one didn't quite meet the brief the way we wish it had. But that doesn't mean we don't think it's A, worth your time, and B, important part of the story they're telling.
100%. So that wraps up our discussion of episode 5. We'll see y'all for episode 6 next week. Take care.
Bye.